All right, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the Payments Request API today, which is a new JavaScript API that can hopefully help us get rid of forms and make web user experiences a lot better. Before I get started, quick background on myself. My name is David. I'm from the United States. In the past, I worked with Google, and now I'm a freelance software engineer for the past few years. I'm currently doing most of my work through, I'm doing most of my work through TopTal at this moment, which is a network for the top freelancers in software, design, and business to connect with top companies. And for the past year and a half, I've been working in the blockchain space, which I see as kind of the future of payments and money on the internet. But at this point, we're still working on the legacy financial system, which means credit cards. So I'll be talking about those today. As many of you know, making payments on the web can be slow and frustrating. If it's loading, but I've included just a quick screen grab I did of going to a random website for making purchases, going through the form, trying to just buy a little toy. And it took me about 2 minutes to complete, which is a long time to fill in all this information here. And if any of you have done work in user experience, you know that every interaction you make, every button you make the user click, every form they have to fill in, that's an opportunity for the user to give up and leave. And this is especially bad when you're on the payment section, because they've already decided to buy something. There was a study. There we go. A study in the US that 26% of US consumers had given up on an online purchase that they were about to make because they thought the process was too slow and not going to work. So that brings us to the Payments Request API. This is a new API. It's currently in development. It's only been coming out over the past few years, but this is a W3 standard. If you don't know what that means this is something that the industry is agreeing on together. This is not a Google feature or an Apple feature. This is something that's currently being implemented across browsers at different levels of implementation, but is going to be a standard that's used everywhere. Before we go too far, I'll say that the Payments Request API is not, it's not a payment processor. This is not facilitating the actual change of money from the user to a company. What this API is intended to do is to help the browser and the operating system, which typically already know a lot of information about a user and about their payment methods. It's intended to help them give consent for the browser and the operating system to give information to a website that would like to make a purchase. And one thing I love about this API is that it can be a bit complex, this API, but a really simple implementation is quite small. I don't know if you can see the code here, but this is just 20 lines of mixed HTML and JavaScript, and that creates this little window here. When I click it, it pops up, since I'm running this presentation in Chrome, it pops up this Payment Request API here. This is what it looks like. I'm requesting $22, and it's showing my American Express card, and I can hit pay, and it would ask me for my security code. And if I put that in, then that would be all we need to collect credit card information and send it back to a server. So I love that it's that simple. And yeah, so now I'm going to dig into kind of how this API works at a code level. At the root, everything is this payment request object. This is a global object that's available in the browser, and it takes 3 attributes to construct it. So I'm going to break down what those are. The first one is payment methods. This is where you specify what type of methods you're going to accept for payment. And this API is intended to be very broad, to accept any kind of payment at some point in time. It's, again, still a new API. But right now, you can implement a number of different payment methods, and these are broken into 2 categories. There's standardized payment methods, which is supposed to be something that every browser can implement. So we'll be talking a lot about this basic card input type, which, if you can't guess, it's a basic credit card. So every browser that has that information can prompt a user for it. URL-based payment methods are for more proprietary payment systems like Google Pay. We'll be talking about those a little bit later. Here's just a list of the payment methods that are defined in the W3 spec. As far as I know, browsers are only implementing basic card at this point, but this is kind of a look at the types of payment methods that this protocol is designed to allow. Interledger was one I hadn't heard of before, and as I said, I work in blockchain, so I'm excited to see that there is a future of this API with some blockchain technology. The second attribute when you're constructing a payment request object is the details. And so this is where you're going to break down everything that the user is buying. You can see here a list of display items. We're laying out a few different toys that the user is going to buy, and a total. Now, one thing about this API is it doesn't do any math for you. It's kind of a low-level API, so you can kind of put whatever you want in the display items. It's still your job as the developer to make sure those items total up to the correct total at the bottom here, because that's the only number that's actually going to be used for this transaction. And the last one, the last option to pass to this constructor is your payment options. So this is where you define any additional kind of non-payment related information you'd like to correct. So if you're selling a physical product, you probably want to prompt for a shipping address. In many cases, you'll probably want to prompt for the email address or the name of the user, unless maybe the user's already logged in. So you can define these here. And I'll also add that the payment options is this entire object is optional. So if you leave this out, then everything will default to false. So those are the three attributes to construct this object. And now we'll go over kind of a few of the methods and events on it. First is this method can make payment. So as I've said, this is a very new API, and support is still a little here and there depending on the browsers. So and also, some browsers might not have any information about a user. So as the developer, you might make the decision that if this API is available and the user can make a quick payment with it, we're going to go forward and use this API, and if not, we're going to use a traditional payment form. So by calling can make payment, you check that the browser has everything it needs, supports everything it needs to actually make this payment. Next, I'm going to go over there's two different events that are available on this this payment request object. The first one is the shipping address change event. So this would be fired when you've displayed a payment request form to the user and they select their delivery address. At this point, mainly what you want to do is calculate some way the shipping options that are available to them. The express shipping or normal shipping, the different prices of that. And you can also return null. You can set the shipping options to null to indicate that there are no shipping options available. So one thing you'd maybe want to do is check the country code. And if you're only supporting a few countries, you can check that country code. And then the way we're going to handle this, so this kind of looks like a normal JavaScript browser event. We define the name of it, and we set a event handler. And then what we do here is we create this payment details object. This is going to work similar to object.assign, where we're defining the elements that we want to change about that payment details object that we put together when we constructed the object. So if we want to update the total, we're going to define the total here. If we want to update shipping options or add shipping options, this is the place for that. And with that object, we pass it to event.updateWith. And now this is an interesting function, event.updateWith, because you can pass in a normal object like we're doing there. You can also give it a promise that will return one of these objects. So this is really cool because it's designed to make it really easy to use promises and to use asynchronous functions in JavaScript. If you're not familiar with asynchronous functions, asynchronous functions will return a promise that gets resolved to some data later. So you can see what we're doing here is we make this get payment details function, which is going to take the shipping address that the user's input, and we call fetch payment details, which would be going to a server, maybe reaching out to shipping companies and calculating the cost of shipping. Once we get that data back, we can return the payment details. So it's really cool to see these native APIs supporting kind of next level JavaScript. The other event that's available is the shipping option change event. This is very similar to the first one. It's an event that's going to let us kind of make changes to our payment details. As I mentioned before, this API does not do any math for you. So if the user selects, you can see here, if they select express shipping, which costs $5, it's your job as a developer to go and add $5 to that total. The other strange thing about this API is the developer also has to mark that shipping option as selected. So you have to go through and mark selected to be true. I'm really not sure why the API requires that, but that's something I've found when using this API. And so once we've defined all those, we've constructed our payment request object, we've defined our event listeners, and maybe even checked if payment requests are supported. Now we have to actually display it to the user. So we do that by calling, oh, no highlighting there. We do that by calling request.show. And again, this returns a promise, which we can await. Request.show is going to bring this form onto the display that the user can look at, and wait until the user clicks buy or checkout. I'm not sure what the button says. Once the user kind of goes through the process, selects everything, and hits OK, then it will resolve with a response, which you can handle, send to your backend to do whatever you want with it. And you should note that at this point, the form is still on the screen. It hasn't gone away. It'll just say loading. So then the developer, once you're done processing it, saving those details, you would call response.complete and give it the complete status of success. And at that point, it will close the form. The other case, when the form goes away, would be if the user hits cancel. In that case, it would kind of throw an error, which you would catch here. And that means you want to maybe update your website to say, oh, you've canceled this purchase. Do you want to make it again? So if we put everything together here, we construct a payment request object, add a shipping event, shipping option event. We define these two events. You can see here at the top I defined a subtotal that we can use when adding the shipping price in. We're going to display the form to the user, and once that's complete, send it to our server and close the form. So that's all you need to do kind of a more comprehensive payment checkout with this API. Here is a quick demo of it. I made a SpongeBob store. So I've made a cart here. When I go to check out, it displays this. I've added this Patrick toy to the summary so we can see the cost of that, $14. I'm going to select my address, and then this, again, we're in Google Chrome. This is going to show kind of your saved addresses. I think everyone's familiar with when you go to a form, Chrome usually already knows your addresses, so that makes it really easy. You don't have to type anything in there. Delivery method, so I've selected my delivery address, and now it's going to show me my methods, and I'll pick express shipping. And you can see the total has updated to include the shipping cost within there. And it has my credit card that's stored in my Chrome account. So yeah, all my data is basically already in here. I haven't had to type a single thing. It's just displaying this form, and I make a few clicks and hit pay. And I don't have my credit card with me, otherwise I would type in that security code. But that's all you would need to make a purchase with this API. Oh, here's a quick clip of how this would all look on mobile. Because again, this API is really intended, especially for mobile, because doing lots of typing and things like that is even more difficult on mobile. And this is supposed to make purchases really easy. So you can see here the form looks basically the same as on desktop. We type in a code and makes a purchase. So we've been going through, everything we've been talking about is this basic card type of checkout, which means the API is actually giving the client the credit card details itself. It's just a string of numbers to represent the credit card number, the expiration date, all the usual credit card information. And so what you would do in this case is send that to your server, which can be a bit, security gets to be a bit of an issue here because, again, you're handling raw credit card information. I'll go over kind of two other, not sure what the word is, methods for making purchases and payments online. This is what's referred to as tokenization type, and in this case, you're going to be collecting the credit card information on a website, sending it to a payment processor like Stripe or Square or PayPal directly from the client, and then that payment processor will give the client back a token. Token corresponds to that specific purchase, and you can then send that token to the server. You can kind of safely do whatever you want with that token and use the token to complete the purchase and not be worried because you're not dealing with actual credit card information. And the other type of payment methods would be link type payment, and this is basically whenever you go to a website and you go to make a purchase and they forward you to PayPal to finish it. Link type means you're basically sending the user over to a third-party payment processor, and that payment processor is responsible for all the details and the security of that. So I was going over these types of payments because this really matters for PCI compliance. Do you guys know what PCI compliance is? Yeah, some people. It's basically a set of rules created by the credit card companies, the credit card payment industry, over what, how to securely store and handle sensitive financial information from the users, mainly credit card numbers. To be able to handle these raw credit card numbers, you need this kind of main PCI DSS certification, which is a very extensive set of rules to follow, and you actually need to be certified by a kind of third-party auditor to fall under that category. So for most people, if you're an enterprise or you're some company that's in the financial space, you might be PCI certified. But for most companies, you're going to fall under these other types of compliance rules, which would be PCI AEP, which is that would be the tokenization type, where you're sending the sensitive information directly to the user, and PCI type A, where the only sensitive thing you're doing is choosing this, basically setting the URL that the user's getting passed over to. The interesting thing that I learned, I guess, while I was researching this, is that you're pretty much always falling under some type of PCI rules. Even if you're completely redirecting the user to PayPal, you fall under this PCI type A compliance, and you need to still have a few types of security mechanism to safely handle that user information. So what this means is that this basically sets us up for URL-based payments and why these are important. This third one here, that's supposed to be Samsung Pay. Looks like the image is broken. These five are, as far as I know, the five companies that at this moment have different levels of support for URL-type payments. And so these are, again, like proprietary payment systems that come from some company, and you're going to say, okay, I'm going to direct my user to use Google Pay. So we're going to look at Google Pay right now. So again, when you use Google Pay is not processing your transaction either. They're still facilitating this purchase. So to use Google Pay, you still need to be using a payment processor. This is the list of payment processors that Google supports, and the ones that have a little box around them are the companies that work in Greece. So if you're working with a Greek company, and Greek banks, then these are the companies that you would want to be using with Google Pay. And so to use these URL-based systems, it's basically, it's very similar to the way we would implement other methods like basic card. So you see for our methods, we're going to say we support basic card as kind of as one option, and we're going to support Google Pay. For a URL-based payment, the supported method is a URL. This is kind of a special URL that's defined by the processor. And then the data, this depends on that processor, not the processor, sorry, the provider itself. So this is the information specific to Google. We're going to say which credit cards we're supporting. Here under this tokenization part, that's where we define the actual payment processor. So I'm using checkout.com. That's their special code, and I would include a special code specific to checkout.com. So this is what you would need to support Google Pay. When you make a purchase here, you will get a token back. This is kind of just an example of what that token looks like. So it's basically just a long string, and you can store that wherever and pass that directly to the payment provider. So in our case, this would be checkout.com, and that payment provider can, you can kind of complete that purchase on the back end without ever handling sensitive credit card information. A quick video of what checkout using Google Pay looks like. You can see it's very similar to the existing, to what we were doing before with basic card. We're prompting the same information, but then, I'll pause it here. Fun fact, Google Pay does not let you do screen recordings, so I had to film my phone. It'll bring up the Google Pay app, or kind of a native overlay, and give you your credit card that's saved with Google Pay and whatnot. And there we go. The purchase has been completed. Okay, so this, I think actually this is the old version of my slides, but one thing that I think is really interesting about using these URL-based payment methods, especially on Android, is that any Android application can define their own payment method. This is cool because this is a way that any Android app can directly communicate with the web page, with a user interacting with the web page. I'm not an Android developer, so I don't totally understand the way this implementation works, but basically, we were using this URL-based system. So if I want to make a payment method called David Pay, and I have, I say that the URL to use this payment method is davidpay.com/pay. At that URL should be basically a manifest file. And that manifest file will define some security attributes about which native Android apps can use that payment method. And then in the in the native Android app itself, you have to respond to the is ready to pay and pay intents. So these intents, again, I don't really know what intent is because I'm not an Android developer, but as I understand, these are the ways that the app receives a notification from the operating system that the user is making a purchase, and then at that point you can display like this UI overlay on the screen and make this purchase. And so this is why on Android you see all these other payment processors, such as Samsung and Alipay and whatnot. Again, we'll look at, this is the table of which providers support which types of payment methods. So again, Android is by far the most compatible operating system for this API and these types of payment methods. You can use Google Pay, and you can use any app that defines defines this payment feature, such as, again, Alipay, Samsung, and I think Stripe are the current apps that support it. The other interesting things here, of course, Apple is the only browser that does not support basic card at this point. So I guess maybe that's Apple being a bit more cautious about, basic card is a kind of a method of exposing raw credit card data to the website. So my guess is that Apple's being a little cautious about giving a native-looking UI element that exposes that. And the other disappointing thing is Firefox does not currently support this API. I put flagged. The code is there. If you start Firefox with a developer flag, then you can access this. So clearly they're working on it, and it should be available soon. But other than that, again, we see lots of support for basic card, and we see lots of different browsers. Pretty much every browser has some level of support for this API at this moment. So if you are building a site that needs to use payments, you probably at this point want to be using a library to handle some of these things for you, because it'll make your life easier, and they'll often give you some fallback methods. So for Google Pay and Apple Pay, Google and Apple both release libraries, so you can use this library, and it will simplify the process of just using Google Pay or just using Apple Pay. And I believe they have fallbacks, so if the device does not support it, you'll get kind of funneled to an old-fashioned web checkout form. But what I would suggest is more using the libraries like Stripe and Braintree. These are both, if you're not aware, like major payment processing, payment facilitating companies that have very popular libraries for doing payments on the web and on mobile. Stripe supports Apple Pay, Google Pay, Microsoft Pay. I didn't even realize Microsoft Pay was a thing until working on this. But yeah, you can kind of support all of those pretty easily. Braintree supports the basic cards. I guess when I put payment request API, I meant basic cards. Braintree will support all of those as well. And again, when you use these Stripe and Braintree are payment processing companies. So they're the ones that are doing this processing. So if you're using basic card with Stripe or with Braintree, you don't have to worry about handling these credit card data. This library takes care of everything for you. This is just a quick look at how you would do this with Stripe. Like I said, again, Stripe supports these major payment types, and you basically import the library into your project, give it the payment details. You have this can make payment method, which is very similar to the can make payment method that we talked about earlier, that comes directly from the payment request API. And if they support this, then you can add this button here. That puts this Stripe button right in your page. They click that, and it'll bring up whatever native payment request type is available. So Google Pay, Apple Pay, or again, falling back to basic card if that's the only one that's available. And if it's not available, then you would show the payment container. Yeah, just show a normal payment container. And again, these libraries have the tools for adding a more traditional payment request form into your site. So that is the state of kind of payment requests at this point. This is, again, very early technology, and we expect lots of changes to be coming soon. I think the most imminent one would be Firefox support. Firefox is clearly working on adding this. The code is there, so I imagine we'll start seeing that come out pretty soon too. I would love if Firefox gave similar support to kind of native URL-based payments, similar to how Android handles it. I think we'll see more support from the major payment processing companies in this space, like PayPal and Square, because this is clearly the future of making payments on the web, and I think it's on these companies to help make things a little simpler. More Android apps, I assume, will be supporting this checkout using a URL-based payment method, because again, it gives it just such an easy user experience. So I think it makes sense for companies like PayPal and Venmo to make their payment app, their Android app, support this so that users can really easily make payments with their app. And then again, with Safari and Apple and iOS, they are supporting it, but I imagine that progress will be a bit slow. So I'm not sure if we're going to see integration with third-party native apps anytime soon, but I would love if they did. So yeah, that is the state of the Payments Request API. And now I'd like to open up to any questions.
Come on. Okay, thank you very much, David. Any questions, everyone? Yep.
Hi. Does this JavaScript payment method that you presented is up to date with strong customer authentication and does support the new 3D version that is coming?
The 3D things, I know that like Google Pay, it supports the 3D verification. I'm not sure how that would work. I guess with Basic Card, that's still going to be on the developer or the library to implement it itself because you're just collecting this information. So I think with a Basic Card type checkout, you'd still be responsible. For anyone that doesn't know, 3D verification, this is kind of a new standard defined by the payment industry where you are typically, I guess, redirected to the credit card company's site to do verification. So I know that Google Pay supports it. I imagine Apple Pay and these other native URL-based providers kind of have that 3D verification built into their software itself. For Basic Card, that's going to be either on the developer to implement it, or I guess the best case would be that you use a library that supports it.
Thank you.
Here we are. I'll take one in the back.
Hey, nice talk.
Thank you.
Can you use this for recurring payments as well, or only for one-off payments?
For recurring payments, it's a good question. Again, I'm assuming Basic Card would support that because again, Basic Card is kind of the low-level. You're just requesting the credit card details, and it's kind of on the developer to decide what to do with that. So if you take that credit card information and go to a payment processor that supports recurring payments, then I don't see any reason why that wouldn't work. In terms of like Google Pay and Apple Pay, I don't know. I'm assuming they don't support that at this time, but maybe that will come eventually. But good question. Anybody else? Someone,
Yes, one in the back. I'll take this one first, then I'll come to you.
In your experience, is there something that is missing from the API, something that is important and the API lacks?
As I mentioned, there was a few things that I thought were interesting in terms of like this API. It doesn't do math for you, which I guess is something that libraries can easily implement. It seems to me that if you want to say, hey, the user's buying 3 products, this is the cost of those products, and the API should be able to add 3 numbers together for you. And also the fact that you had to, when the user clicks a shipping method, that the API has to mark that as selected. Those seem like easy things it could do for you. Big picture, other than that, no, I think the API, again, it's a little bit of a low-level API, so some of these things that are missing are kind of on libraries and third-party companies to implement. But yeah, I would just love to see kind of more support, more payment types other than Basic Card. But the library itself, the API, I think is good. One back here.
Hello. Is it possible to use this API in hybrid mobile applications like Ionic?
Within native mobile applications?
Sorry?
You're saying within like web-based mobile applications?
It's web-based application, web-based technology. So if it's possible to use this kind of JavaScript, if it's compatible with all these things.
I believe it is. I believe, again, I'm not sure how this would work with like a Basic Card type, but when I was looking into the way that URL-based payment methods work, it says that this is not it's not part of Chrome on Android. It's part of like the Android, it's not called WebKit anymore. but the native Android web rendering engine supports this, which means that any app that's web-based should be able to support like Google Pay and Apple Pay easily. So that's very nice.
But it has some problems with iOS.
Sorry?
But it has some problems with iOS.
Yeah, again, iOS I believe is more limited. I don't actually know whether web-based iOS apps would have access to this or not. Yeah, I'm not sure, sorry. All right, I think that's it for questions. Or anything else?
Any more final questions? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you guys very
All
much.
right.
Have a good day.